The old house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its towering silhouette framed by twisted trees that seemed to lean in as if whispering secrets. Its faded, peeling paint and crooked shutters gave it an air of abandonment, though it had stood for over a century. A for sale sign still swayed slightly in the breeze when the moving truck pulled up. The Roberts family stepped out, each one with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The father, Mark, admired the large yard and sprawling porch, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a good deal. The mother, Rachel, clutched a box labeled kitchen, her lips curving into a hopeful smile. And then there was 14-year-old Ellie, standing frozen on the cracked pavement. Ellie couldn't explain it, but the moment her eyes met the gaping windows of the house, her stomach tightened. It was as if the house had been waiting for them. The move-in went smoothly at first. Boxes were carried in, rooms were assigned, and laughter echoed through the halls as they unpacked. Yet Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, she caught a glimpse of shadows in her peripheral vision, shadows that moved when no one else did. By sunset, the family sat down to a makeshift dinner on the living room floor. The soft glow of candles lit the room, the electricity still not fully operational. Mark cracked jokes about the house's charming quirks, but even he seemed uneasy when the wind rattled the loose window panes. Ellie excused herself early, dragging her tired feet up the creaking stairs to her new bedroom. It was small but cozy, with wallpaper so old it had started to curl at the edges. She tried to dismiss the chill in the air, telling herself it was just an old house adjusting to its new occupants. The house fell silent after the lights went out. Ellie lay in bed, her eyes wide open as she stared at the ceiling. The faint sound of her parents murmuring downstairs soon faded, leaving only the ticking of an old clock somewhere in the distance. Then the whispers began. At first, Ellie thought it was the wind. It came as a faint hum, like voices carried on a breeze. But as the minutes dragged on, the sounds grew clearer, more deliberate. A hushed conversation seemed to unfold in the hallway outside her door. Heart pounding, Ellie sat up in bed. "Mom? Dad?" she called out softly, but the whispers stopped abruptly, as if they'd been caught. Gathering her courage, she swung her legs off the bed and tiptoed to the door. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she turned the knob and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through a window at the far end. Just as she was about to retreat, a faint sound made her freeze. The door creaked open, slowly, deliberately, from somewhere downstairs. Ellie's breath hitched. Her mind raced with rational explanations. The wind, the settling house, maybe even her dad checking something. But deep down, she knew. She felt it. A sudden chill brushed past her, making the hair on her arms stand on end. She stepped back into her room, slammed the door, and dove under the covers, trembling. Downstairs, Rachel turned to Mark, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, it's just the house," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But Ellie wasn't so sure. That first night, she learned the house wasn't just old, it was alive. And it had been waiting for them. The house had settled into its eerie rhythm, and the Roberts family was learning to live with its peculiarities, though not without unease. The once exciting adventure of moving into an old historic home had soured into something more unsettling. It began with the footsteps. Late at night, when the world outside was silent, The creak of floorboards would echo down the hallway. They were deliberate, heavy steps, as if someone unseen paced back and forth. Rachel was the first to notice. One night, as she folded laundry in the bedroom, the sound began again. Thud, thud, thud. Mark, she called out. Her husband's voice came from downstairs. What? Rachel's heart skipped. She slowly opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing, just shadows stretching along the wooden floor. The footsteps stopped, but the heavy weight of their presence lingered in the air. Ellie had heard them too, always just behind her, like a companion that never showed its face. The mirror stood in the upstairs hallway, tall and ornate with a tarnished brass frame. It had come with the house, too heavy and cumbersome for the previous owners to bother moving. At first, it seemed harmless, a relic of another time. But then Ellie noticed it. One afternoon, she stood before the mirror, brushing her hair. The light streamed through the nearby window, making her reflection glow. She turned to pick up a hair clip, and when she glanced back, her reflection hadn't moved. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and still, as if frozen in time. Ellie backed away, her pulse racing. The reflection finally moved, mimicking her actions again, but not before Ellie saw it. A shadowy figure loomed in the background, just beyond the mirror's edge, where no one should have been. The mirror stood in the upstairs hallway, tall and ornate with a tarnished brass frame. It had come with the house, too heavy and cumbersome for the previous owners to bother moving. At first, it seemed harmless, a relic of another time. But then Ellie noticed it. One afternoon, she stood before the mirror, brushing her hair. The light streamed through the nearby window, making her reflection glow. She turned to pick up a hair clip, and when she glanced back, her reflection hadn't moved. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and still, as if frozen in time. Ellie backed away, her pulse racing. The reflection finally moved, mimicking her actions again, but not before Ellie saw it. A shadowy figure loomed in the background, just beyond the mirror's edge, where no one should have been. It was Rachel who first noticed the missing keys. Has anyone seen my car keys? She asked one morning, rifling through drawers and countertops. They turned up hours later, neatly placed on the coffee table in the living room, a place she was certain she hadn't left them. The incidents grew more bizarre. Chairs shifted ever so slightly from their original positions. The kitchen cabinet doors would be ajar, even after Rachel made sure they were closed. Once, Mark left his phone on the kitchen counter, only to find it balanced precariously on the staircase railing minutes later. "This house is playing games with us," he muttered under his breath. The living room was cozy, with a plush couch and a fireplace that crackled warmly in the evenings. But there was one corner where warmth never reached. Ellie called it the ice zone. No matter how high the thermostat was set, that corner remained frigid. You could see your breath if you stood there long enough. Even the dog refused to go near it, growling softly when anyone approached. One evening, Rachel decided she'd had enough. Armed with a space heater, she plugged it in and aimed it directly at the cold spot. The heater roared to life, blasting warm air into the corner. But instead of warming up, the chill seemed to deepen, as if the house itself was fighting back. The heater flickered and died. Rachel shivered, rubbing her arms. "This house," she whispered, "doesn't want us here." Mark tried to dismiss it, brushing off each incident with logic and reason. But as the strange occurrences piled up, even he couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong with the house. And whatever it wasn't going anywhere. The footsteps, the mirror, the moving objects, and the cold spot were just the beginning. The house had stories to tell, and the Roberts were living right in the middle of them. As the days stretched on in the old house, the unease that had once lingered on the edges of their lives began to creep inward. The Roberts family could no longer chalk everything up to the quirks of an old home. Something else was at play here, something unseen, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. It was late one evening when Ellie first saw it. She had stayed up too late, her schoolwork forgotten on the desk beside her bed, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. As she glanced out the window, the moonlight illuminated the hallway just beyond her door, bathing the walls in a soft glow. And then, in the stillness, she saw it. A figure, tall, dark, and seemingly made of shadow, stood at the end of the hallway. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, standing still, watching her. Ellie's breath caught in her chest as her heart raced. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was just the house settling or a trick of the light. But when she blinked, the figure didn't vanish. Instead, it seemed to lean forward, just slightly, as though it were observing her with a sense of purpose. Without thinking, she rushed to the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The figure was gone, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real, that it had been waiting for her to see it. That night, Ellie fell asleep with a lingering image of the shadow in her mind. But as soon as her eyes closed, something worse awaited her. She found herself standing in the living room of the house, the flickering light from the fireplace casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. She tried to call out for her parents, but her voice was muffled, as if the air itself was thick and oppressive. The room felt wrong, too cold, too empty. She turned to leave, but when she reached the door, the handle wouldn't turn. She tugged, pulled, but remained steadfastly locked. From behind her, a soft whisper tickled her ears, too faint to make out, but was enough to send her heart pounding. Slowly she turned. The shadow figure stood there, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Its face was obscured, but Ellie could feel its gaze piercing through her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet began to crack, splintering open like a fissure in the earth. Ellie fell, tumbling into a darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. When she hit the ground, she woke with a start, her body covered in sweat, her heart hammering in her chest. But it wasn't just a nightmare. The room still felt cold, the air still thick, as if the terror from her dream had followed her into the waking world. And Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had been more than just a dream, that it had been real. The basement had always been off limits. It was dark, musty, and smelled faintly of mildew. But curiosity got the better of Ellie one afternoon when she found the door cracked open. As she stepped inside, the air grew even colder, and the hairs on her arms prickled with an eerie sensation. The basement was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling. Boxes were stacked high, and old furniture sat abandoned in the corners. But what caught Ellie's attention was a faint sound, a soft dragging noise that seemed to come from the farthest corner of the room. Her feet froze in place. The dragging sound grew louder, the air growing colder with every inch she moved forward. It was as if someone, was slowly dragging itself across the floor, inch by agonizing inch. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the source of the noise. There, in the corner, a figure crouched low to the ground. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its long, bony fingers scraped across the floor with a sickening sound. It didn't turn to face her, but Ellie could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like a shadow wrapped in flesh. The figure let out a low, guttural moan. Ellie's blood ran cold. She stepped back, stumbling over a box, but before she could run, the figure slowly raised its head. It was face to face with her now, its hollow eyes staring into hers with an intensity that made her legs go weak. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving Ellie standing alone in the freezing, empty basement. She ran upstairs, heart racing, barely able to breathe. But the terror followed her, lingering in the air like a cold whisper. And as she lay in bed that night, her mind replayed the image of the ghost, the dragging, hollow figure that still haunted her thoughts. It was only then that Ellie realized the house wasn't just haunted by shadows and whispers. It was haunted by something much darker, something that had been waiting in the depths of the basement for far too long. The Roberts family had tried to push past the eerie occurrences, hoping that if they ignored the strange events long enough, they would stop. But the house had other plans. It was no longer just Ellie who felt its presence. It was starting to creep into the lives of the entire family. It was late one evening when Rachel first heard it, the voice that wasn't Ellie's, but sounded just like her. She had just finished putting away the dishes, the soft hum of the fridge filling the quiet kitchen, when she heard her daughter's voice call from upstairs. "Mom? Mom, I need you." Rachel furrowed her brow, brushing the hair from her face as she made her way up the stairs. But the more she listened, the more unsettling the voice became. There was something off about it. As she reached the top of the stairs, the voice came again, louder this time, almost pleading. "Mom, help me." Rachel's footsteps faltered. Ellie had been in the bathroom. She was sure of it. She opened the door to Ellie's room, but no one was there. The room was dark, the bed neatly made. The voice didn't come again, but the sense of something wrong lingered. She rushed to the bathroom, her mind racing. "Ellie," she called. Ellie peeked out from behind the shower curtain, looking confused. "What's wrong, Mom?" Rachel's heart raced. "You didn't call me just now." Ellie shook her head, puzzled. "No, I didn't." Rachel stood frozen in the hallway, staring down at her daughter, the unsettling feeling creeping over her again. The voice had been unmistakable. It had come from upstairs, hadn't it? Ellie's little sister, Emma, had always been a dreamer. At 6 years old, she had a habit of playing with what she called imaginary friends. But lately, her descriptions had started to unsettle everyone. "I'm playing with Liam," Emma would say, grinning as she twirled around the living room. "He's really nice, but he's sad sometimes. I don't know why." Liam. They didn't know any Liam. At first, they thought it was just a phase, a product of a child's boundless imagination. But Emma's stories began to grow more detailed, too detailed. Liam doesn't like the basement, Emma said one afternoon, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He says it's dark down there, but he doesn't like the light either. Rachel exchanged a worried glance with Mark. What do you mean? Why doesn't Liam like the light? Emma's expression turned serious, her tone flat. Because the light makes him go away. He gets mad. He doesn't want to go to the basement anymore. Emma's game continued, with Liam appearing in the most unlikely places, sometimes staring at the family from the shadows, sometimes watching them from the corner of the room. Emma seemed unaware of the unnerving nature of her playmate. One evening, Rachel found Emma sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, talking softly to someone, though no one else was there. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. Emma looked up, a strange glint in her eye. "Liam's playing in the basement. He said he wants you to come." A shiver ran down Rachel's back. There was something about the way Emma said it, so matter-of-fact, so calm, that made her question everything. The basement. Again. Mark had always been the skeptic. A man of logic and reason, he had brushed off every strange occurrence with a well-practiced excuse. The voices were the house settling. The cold spots, draft, and the creaky floors. Just an old building. But that all changed one afternoon when he was alone in the house. The rest of the family had gone to the store, leaving Mark to tackle a few overdue repairs. He was in the attic, fixing a loose beam, when he heard it, a loud crash from downstairs, followed by a soft, echoing sound, as though something had fallen. He paused, his hammer frozen in midair. The house had always made odd noises, but this was different. The sound of footsteps on the stairs followed, slow and deliberate, as if someone were coming up. Mark's heart raced. He wiped his hands on his jeans and headed toward the stairs. The house was eerily silent now. He called out, "Rachel, Ellie, Emma." There was no response. He made his way down the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. As he rounded the corner into the living room, the air grew cold. His breath fogged in front of him. And then, in the center of the room, he saw it. A chair had been overturned, its legs splayed awkwardly across the floor. And sitting in the middle of the room, staring directly at him, was the figure of a tall man, dark and indistinct, like a silhouette made of shadow. Mark froze. He blinked. The figure was gone. He turned, running his hand through his hair, as he tried to catch his breath. His mind raced for an explanation, but deep down, he knew what he had seen. When the family returned home, Mark was waiting for them, pale and shaken. "I saw it," he said, his voice unsteady. "I saw something, and I don't know what it was." Rachel looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of concern and relief. She had known somehow. She had always known. The house had claimed another skeptic. And now Mark too believed in the things that lingered in the shadows. The house had always been a mystery, a place where things didn't quite add up, where shadows seemed to shift on their own, and the air felt thicker than it should. But as the months passed and the incidents grew more terrifying, the Roberts family decided they couldn't just ignore it anymore. They needed answers. It was Ellie who found the first clue. She had been rummaging through the attic, looking for old family photos for a school project when she stumbled upon a dusty leather-bound book. Its pages were yellowed and brittle with age, the spine cracked and fragile. On the cover, in faded gold lettering, it read, "The History of Hawthorne Manor." Intrigued, Ellie flipped it open. The first pages described the house's construction in the late 1800s, the lavish lifestyle of its original owners, the Hawthorne family. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Whispers of tragedy, of misfortune, and of death began to surface. One name caught her eye, Richard Hawthorne, the patriarch. According to the book, he had been a well-known local businessman, but his reputation had taken a dark turn. Rumors spread that he had been involved in occult practices, holding strange ceremonies in the house's vast cellar. The whispers grew darker, hinting at rituals gone wrong and sacrifices made to unseen forces. Ellie's hands trembled as she continued to read. The Hawthorne family had died under mysterious circumstances, one by one. Richard's wife had vanished without a trace. His children died in a fire that some claimed had been intentionally started. But it wasn't the tragedies themselves that unnerved Ellie. It was the final line of the last entry. The house has a will of its own, and it waits. Ellie closed the book with a soft thud, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't tell her parents yet. Not yet. But she knew now that the house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Desperate to find answers, Rachel suggested they try to communicate with the spirits directly. The events had become too overwhelming, too terrifying to ignore. She had heard about seances, ways to contact the spirits trapped in the house, to understand their motives and perhaps even find a way to break the curse. Against Mark's better judgment, the family decided to proceed. They found a medium, a woman named Miriam, who had dealt with haunted houses before. Miriam was calm, collected, and assured them that the spirits they would contact were simply trapped, needing closure. That evening, the family gathered in the dimly lit living room, the windows closed against the chill. Candles flickered around the table, casting long shadows across the room. Miriam placed her hands on the edge of the table, her voice low and steady. "We are here to communicate. If there are spirits in this house, we ask that you show yourself." Ellie felt a wave of unease wash over her. The air seemed to thicken, growing colder, almost suffocating. Miriam's voice deepened, her eyes now closed, her hands twitching slightly as though something were pulling at them. "I feel a presence," Miriam said softly. "A powerful one. But it's not at peace." The temperature in the room dropped, and a sudden sharp bang echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. The family jumped, their eyes wide with fear. Miriam's voice trembled now. "It's angry. It doesn't want to talk. It..." Before she could finish, the lights flickered and the table jerked violently, nearly knocking over the candles. Everyone gasped as they watched the table's surface rise and fall, as though something invisible were pushing against it. Miriam gasped, her eyes snapping open, wide with terror. "No, no, it's too much. It's too strong," she cried. The candles sputtered, their flames flickering out, plunging the room into darkness. The family was paralyzed in the blackness, unable to move. Only the sound of frantic breathing filled the room. A low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled from the shadows. Ellie's heart raced as she felt something brush against her arm, cold, clammy fingers that sent a jolt of terror through her. Then the growl was replaced by a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper. Then it grew louder, more menacing. "Leave, or you will be next." Rachel screamed, reaching for the light switch. But when the light came on, the room was empty. The table was back to its original position, and the air felt suddenly warmer. Miriam stood up, shaking. That was not a spirit. That was something else. "You must leave this house before it consumes you." The family never spoke of the seance again, but the terror lingered in their hearts. It was clear now the house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was the birthplace of something darker, something far older than the Hawthorne family. What had started as a desperate attempt to find answers had only opened the door to a greater nightmare, one they couldn't escape. The Roberts family had learned to live with the house's supernatural presence. They had become accustomed to the unexplained noises and eerie cold spots, but there were moments when the house would reveal something far darker, moments when the spirits themselves seemed to have a story to tell. It started with Ellie. She had been in the living room, reading one evening when she first saw her, a figure in the doorway, standing motionless in the dim light of the hallway. The figure was tall, slender, and draped in a flowing white dress that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, but her face was hidden in shadow. At first, Ellie thought it was just her imagination. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, the woman was still there, standing silently as if waiting for something. Frozen with fear, Ellie couldn't move. She opened her mouth to call out, but no words came. The figure didn't step forward or speak. She simply stood there, an ethereal presence. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She watched as the woman slowly turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows beyond. Terrified, Ellie rushed to tell her mother, but when they checked the hallway, the woman was gone. The family dismissed it as another one of the house's many tricks, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the woman wasn't just a ghost. She was a memory tied to the house itself. A week later, Ellie stumbled upon an old letter buried in one of the attic boxes. It was written in flowing, elegant handwriting, and the ink had long since faded. The letter was dated over a century ago, addressed to the first Mrs. Hawthorne. It described a tragic love affair, one that had ended in betrayal and heartbreak. The letter spoke of a woman in white, a woman who had been abandoned by the man she loved, and who, in her grief, had taken her own life in the very room Ellie had seen her. Ellie's heart sank. She realized then the woman in the white dress wasn't just wandering the house. She was reliving her tragic fate, her soul forever tethered to the place where her life had ended. The attic had always been a place of mystery, a part of the house that no one dared to enter unless absolutely necessary. It was dark, cramped, and smelled of dust and old memories. But it was the attic where Mark had his most terrifying encounter. It was late one night when Mark went up to check on a leaking pipe. He didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just a simple task. But as he made his way up the narrow staircase, a cold chill wrapped around him, making him pause. He shook it off as the usual draft, but the feeling lingered. The attic was just as he remembered it, cluttered with boxes and old furniture, the light bulb flickering overhead. But then, as he moved closer to the far corner, he heard it, the sound of breathing. Mark stopped. The breathing was slow and labored, as though someone or something was waiting in the shadows. He turned around, but no one was there. His breath caught in his throat. The air grew colder, and the floor creaked beneath him, but it wasn't just the house settling. Mark could feel the weight of something watching him, something that didn't want him there. Then a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards. Before Mark could react, a shadow darted across the room, moving too fast for him to follow. It was followed by a voice angry, distorted, and filled with rage. "Get out." Mark froze. He turned, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the shadows in the attic seemed to shift, grow darker, more alive. The temperature dropped even further, and the growling grew louder, closer. In a flash, Mark bolted from the attic, slamming the door behind him. His heart raced as he leaned against the door, gasping for air. He knew then there was something in the attic, something dangerous. The family tried to avoid the attic after that, but it wasn't easy. The entity that lingered there seemed to resent their presence, as though it was angry that they had dared to enter its domain. But it wasn't just anger. It was something older, something darker. A spirit that had been trapped in that attic for generations, and it had no intention of letting the family get too comfortable in the house it had once called its own. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew even more oppressive. The spirits with their stories, the woman in the white dress, the angry spirit in the attic, seemed to be warning the family. But warning them of what? The house had its secrets, and the more they uncovered, the more they realized that some stories were best left untold. The Roberts family had reached a breaking point. The house had become an unbearable nightmare, one that no one in the family could escape. Each night, the spirits seemed to grow more powerful, their presence more oppressive. The whispers, the cold spots, the shadows. It was as if the house itself had a will of its own. They needed to do something drastic. In their desperation, Rachel had contacted Father Thomas, an elderly priest who had performed many exorcisms in his long career. He had listened to their story with quiet sympathy, and after a long pause, he had agreed to come. The night he arrived, the house felt different. The air was thick with tension, as though the spirits themselves were preparing for the confrontation. Father Thomas carried with him a small worn bag. Inside, tools he had used in countless rituals, a crucifix, holy water, candles, and incense. He walked through the house slowly, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning the rooms with a sense of quiet authority. As he entered the living room, the temperature seemed to drop, and the light bulbs flickered ominously. But Father Thomas wasn't deterred. He set up his things on the table in the center of the room, his voice low and steady as he began the ritual. "By the power of God, I command you to leave this place. You are not welcome here," he intoned, his hands raised as he sprinkled holy water across the floor. At first, nothing happened. The family stood huddled in the doorway, watching as Father Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. But then a soft whispering filled the air, like a chorus of voices, low and indistinct. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The temperature dropped even further. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. And then, in the distance, the unmistakable sound of footsteps began, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. Father Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You are not welcome here," he repeated, his voice now a commanding shout. "I command you, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, leave this house and never return." For a moment, everything went still. The whispers faded, and the footsteps stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room, the air thick with the remnants of the ritual. Father Thomas lowered his hands, his face pale but resolute. "It is done," he said quietly. "But beware, the house will fight to keep its hold." The family stood in the doorway, their hearts pounding. Had it worked? Was the house finally free of its haunting? For a brief moment, there was no sound at all. The wind had stopped howling, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to recede, and even the temperature had returned to normal. It was as if the house itself had taken a deep breath and paused. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Ellie glanced nervously at the others, but none of them dared to speak. The quiet was so complete, it was almost oppressive. They had never known this kind of stillness in the house before. It felt unnatural. Then, as if on cue, Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Do you think it's over?" But just as she spoke, the lights flickered once, twice, before going completely dark. The family gasped, the sudden darkness washing over them like a wave. Then a low rumble echoed through the house, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It wasn't a growl, but something deeper, something more ancient. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and a distant door slammed somewhere in the house, though no one had touched it. Father Thomas's eyes narrowed, his expression grim. "The house has not given up yet," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of warning. "It will take time for the spirits to be fully banished." The family exchanged anxious glances, but Father Thomas motioned for them to remain calm. "The ritual has weakened their hold. It will take time for the house to regain its strength. But you must remain vigilant." They could feel the oppressive weight of the house returning, like a shadow closing in around them. Yet there was something different in the air. Something was no longer lurking in the darkness, waiting to pounce. There was still a presence, but it was no longer the overwhelming force it had been before. The house was quieter now. The whispers had faded, the footsteps had stopped, and even the shadows seemed to retreat. But that silence, that unnatural calm, left them with a feeling of unease. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The family would never forget that night. The ritual had not brought them the peace they had hoped for, but it had changed something. The house was still haunted, still very much alive, but for the first time in months, they felt like they had taken a step toward reclaiming their home. After 10 long years, the Roberts family had made a decision that weighed heavily on their hearts. They were leaving. The house, once a place of dreams and promise, had become a prison of nightmares. The spirits, the shadows, the whispers, they were no longer just phenomena they could live with. They were part of the fabric of the house, woven into its very walls. It had been a difficult choice, but in the end, they knew it was the only way to move forward. The day had come. The house sat silent as the Roberts family packed their belongings into boxes, its walls still heavy with memories. The furniture that had once filled the rooms with warmth was now gone, leaving behind empty spaces that echoed with the ghosts of past. Ellie stood by the window, looking out at the front yard for the last time. The trees, the overgrown ivy, the cracked stone steps. It was all so familiar, yet it felt foreign now. The house had changed her. It had changed all of them. But as she gazed out, she felt a strange sense of relief. Behind her, Rachel was packing the last of the dishes, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused for a moment, looking around the room. There was a sense of finality in the air, quiet resignation. The house had fought them every step of the way, but they had fought back and held on long enough to see the end of this chapter of their lives. But there was something else too, something bittersweet. For all the fear, the pain, and the terror they had endured, the house had also shaped them. It had tested their limits, had pushed them to the edge, but had also taught them lessons they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Mark, carrying the last of their things to the car, paused in the doorway. His eyes lingered on the empty living room, the shadows of memories dancing across the floor. For a moment, he felt the pull of the house, as if it were trying to keep them there. But he shook his head, knowing it was time. Time to leave. The family gathered in the driveway, their cars packed with everything they owned. As they looked back at the house one final time, they all felt the weight of its presence, still looming in the distance. But for the first time, it wasn't a place of fear. It was just a house they were leaving behind. And with that, they drove away. Months passed, and life began to settle. The Roberts family found a new home, one that didn't come with whispers in the walls or shadows in the corners. But no matter how far they had gone, the house stayed with them in their memories. Ellie often found herself staring out the window of their new home, lost in thought. The experiences, the terror, and the strange comfort of knowing the spirits were always with her. It had all shaped her into someone different, someone stronger. The house had taught her more than she could have ever expected. It had shown her the depths of fear, the kind that made your heart race and your breath catch in your throat. But it had also shown her resilience. The ability to endure when it felt like the walls were closing in, when every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. It had taught her that fear wasn't something to run from. It was something to face head on. For Rachel, the lessons were more about perseverance. She had never believed in ghosts, never imagined that such things could take root in a home. But the house had forced her to confront the unknown. It had challenged her to remain calm in the face of the impossible, to trust in her own strength when everything around her seemed to fall apart. Mark, ever the skeptic, had been the hardest to convince that the house was more than just a series of strange events. But in the end, he had seen the truth, had felt the weight of the spirits that lived there. The house had humbled him, taught him that there were things in this world that couldn't be explained. And though he still didn't fully understand it, he had learned to respect the unknown. In the quiet moments, when the family gathered around the dinner table in their new home, they would share stories, stories of the house, of the things they had endured together. They spoke not with fear, but with respect, knowing that what they had gone through had brought them closer. They had faced the darkness, and they had survived. As they moved forward, the house they had left behind became less of a nightmare and more of a chapter in their lives. A chapter filled with lessons of fear, courage, and survival. They had learned that the spirit world wasn't just something to be feared. It was something to be understood. And as they carried on, they knew they would never forget the house that had changed them forever.